"You seem awfully defensive," he said, handing the card back. "Most people cooperate without all this attitude." Margaret looked at him, her expression unreadable. She could have let it go, could have walked away without saying another word, but instead she decided to hold her ground. "And most officers don't harass innocent people walking home from the store," she replied, her voice firm but calm. Brent's face darkened, his hand once again hovering near his holster. "Watch yourself, lady," he snapped. "I'm just doing my job." But before he could say anything else, Margaret did something that caught him completely off guard. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a small leather case, flipping it open to reveal a gold badge and an ID card. The words were clear as day. Asterisk Federal Bureau of Investigation asterisk. Brent's mouth opened slightly, his confidence faltering for the first time. Margaret held his gaze, her expression steady. "You're right, officer," she said, her voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "You asterisk are asterisk just doing your job. And so am I." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The neighbors watched in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the two figures at the center of the confrontation. Brent's face turned pale as the weight of what he had just done began to sink in. But before he could respond, Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced down at the screen and gave a small, knowing smile. "Well," she said, slipping the badge back into her pocket and picking up her grocery bag, "I'd love to stay and chat, Officer Harper, but I've got a meeting to attend. You have a nice day." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Brent standing there in the middle of the sidewalk, his confidence shattered, his reputation hanging by a thread. But what Brent didn't know, what no one in that quiet little neighborhood knew, was that this was just the beginning. Because Margaret Daniels wasn't just any FBI agent, she was one of the best, and she wasn't about to let this slide. How does that feel? Do you want to adjust the tone, pacing, or add more suspense? Brent Harper stood frozen on the sidewalk, his pulse racing as Margaret Daniels disappeared around the corner. He could still hear the faint sound of her heels clicking against the pavement, each step like a reminder of his mistake. The badge, the words Federal Bureau of Investigation, flashed in his mind over and over again. What had he done? What had he almost done? His hands clenched into fists as he replayed the encounter in his head, every word, every movement. He'd approached her like he had 100 other people, like he always did when someone caught his attention. But this wasn't just some random person. She was an FBI agent, a federal agent. Someone with the power to destroy his career with a single phone call. He turned back toward his patrol car, his mind racing. He needed to think, to figure out how to handle this. Could she report him? Would she? Brent had dealt with complaints before, people accusing him of profiling, of being too aggressive. His department always backed him up. "You're just following protocol," they'd say. But this was different. This wasn't a complaint from a civilian. This was an FBI agent. Meanwhile, Margaret walked down the street, her posture calm and composed, though her mind was anything but. She'd handled situations like this before, but they always left a bad taste in her mouth. It wasn't the confrontation itself. Margaret was more than capable of standing her ground. It was the principle of it. How many people like her had been stopped and questioned by officers like Brent Harper, people who thought their badge gave them the right to act with impunity? Margaret sighed, adjusting the bag of groceries in her hand as she approached her house. She'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to know that most people here kept to themselves. They smiled, waved politely, but rarely went beyond surface-level interactions. Still, she'd always felt a sense of responsibility to stay involved, to be visible. She knew what it meant for the kids in the area to see someone like her, a successful black woman, living here, working here, belonging here. She unlocked her front door and stepped inside, setting the groceries on the kitchen counter. Her house was modest but well kept, with bookshelves lining the walls and family photos scattered across the living room. She walked over to a small wooden desk by the window, where her laptop sat open. Margaret pulled out her phone, glancing at the missed calls and emails that had piled up during her meeting earlier. One message in particular caught her eye. It was from her supervisor at the bureau, a short but urgent note asking her to check in as soon as possible. Margaret frowned. She hadn't expected anything pressing today. Her current case was in its quieter stages, mostly paperwork and follow-ups. But she dialed the number, waiting as the line rang. "Daniels," came the voice on the other end. It was her supervisor, Agent Collins, a no-nonsense man who rarely minced words. "Collins," Margaret replied, her tone professional. "I saw your message. What's going on?" There was a pause, the kind that carried weight. "We've got a situation," Collins said finally. "Something local. I need you to look into it." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Local? I thought my next assignment was in D.C. "It was," Collins said. "But this takes priority. There's been some chatter about corruption in the local police department, your department. Nothing solid yet, but enough to raise flags. I need someone on the ground, someone who knows the area. And well, you're already there." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Corruption in the local police? It wasn't entirely surprising. Every department had its issues. But for the Bureau to get involved, it had to be more than just a few bad apples. "What kind of corruption are we talking about?" she asked. Collins hesitated again, and Margaret could almost hear him weighing how much to tell her. "It's early," he said finally. "But there have been reports of misuse of force, profiling, and even some missing evidence in a few key cases. I don't need to tell you how messy this could get." Margaret nodded, her thoughts immediately flashing back to her encounter with Brent Harper. Was he part of this? Or was he just another symptom of a larger problem? Either way, Margaret knew she couldn't ignore it. "I'll look into it," she said, discreetly. "Good," Collins said. "I'll send you everything we have so far. Be careful, Daniels. If there's something going on, the last thing we need is to spook anyone before we have proof." After hanging up, Margaret sat in silence for a moment, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly even in the most chaotic situations. But this felt personal. It wasn't just about the Bureau or the case. It was about her home, her community. She opened her laptop and began sifting through the files Collins had sent. Most of it was preliminary, internal complaints, vague witness statements, nothing that screamed smoking gun. But there was a pattern, subtle but clear. The same names kept coming up, and one of them was Brent Harper. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her jaw tightening. Harper. She thought back to the way he had approached her on the street, the way he had spoken to her, the way his hand had hovered near his weapon, as if she were a threat. She closed her laptop and stood walking over to the window. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet again, the earlier tension seeming like a distant memory. But Margaret knew better. Beneath the surface, something was bubbling, something that could explode if it wasn't handled carefully. Across town, Brent sat in his patrol car, parked in an empty lot. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he stared out the window, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Margaret Daniels' badge, the way she had looked at him with that calm, steady gaze. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, his finger hovering over the number for his sergeant. Should he report the encounter? Try to get ahead of it? But what would he even say? That he'd stopped an FBI agent for no reason other than his own biases. That he'd practically accused her of being a criminal. Brent slammed the phone down on the passenger seat, frustration boiling over. He wasn't the kind of man who admitted mistakes easily. He told himself he'd been doing his job, that he had a right to question anyone who looked suspicious. But deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't stopped Margaret because she looked suspicious. He'd stopped her because of what he saw when he looked at her. And now it was coming back to haunt him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the quiet suburb seemed to hold its breath, the tension from earlier lingering like a shadow. Margaret knew this was just the beginning. Brent knew it too. But neither of them could have predicted just how deep the story would go or how dangerous it would become. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft hum of the refrigerator. But her mind wouldn't settle. She had been through enough in her career to know that things like this, cases of corruption, misuse of power, rarely stayed small. They were like weeds. Once you started pulling, you found roots tangled deep below the surface. And judging by the files Collins had sent her, this particular patch of weeds was going to take a lot of digging. She sat at her desk with a cup of tea, staring at the names in the reports. Brent Harper wasn't the only one who stood out, but he was the freshest in her mind. Margaret remembered his expression earlier that day, the mix of arrogance and insecurity, and the way his tone shifted when she revealed who she really was. It wasn't just embarrassment. There was fear there, too. She didn't know yet what he was afraid of, but she intended to find out. The next day, Margaret decided to step back into the neighborhood, but this time with a purpose. She wasn't just going for a walk. She was watching, observing, trying to piece together the dynamic of this community that she had called home for so long. She noticed the small things first, how certain houses seemed more worn than others, despite being built at the same time. How certain families avoided certain streets. How, despite the overall quiet of the area, there were invisible lines that no one seemed to cross. At the same time, Brent was sitting in his precinct's break room, staring blankly at the coffee cup in his hands. He couldn't shake the memory of Margaret's badge, couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that he'd stepped into something much bigger than he realized. He'd spent years on the force building a reputation, navigating the unspoken rules of the department, and learning how to stay in good standing with the higher-ups. He wasn't perfect. No one was. But he knew how to play the game. Or at least he thought he did. "Harper," a voice called, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see his partner, a younger officer named Jake Martinez, standing in the doorway. Jake had a way of lightening the mood, always cracking jokes and keeping things casual. But today, his face was serious. "You okay? You've been sitting here for a while." Brent nodded quickly, masking his unease. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." Jake grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "You sure? You've been off since yesterday. Something happened on patrol." Brent hesitated. He trusted Jake more than most of the guys on the force, but even so, he didn't know how much to share. "I had a run-in with someone. It was complicated." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" Brent looked down at his coffee. She was FBI. Jake nearly choked on his drink. FBI. What the hell were you doing pulling over an FBI agent? "I didn't know she was FBI." Brent snapped, his frustration spilling over. She looked out of place, okay?" "I stopped her, asked for ID, and then she pulled out her badge." Jake stared at him for a moment, then let out a low whistle. "Man, you really stepped in it, huh? What did she say?" Brent shrugged, trying to play it off. "Not much. She just walked away." But Jake wasn't convinced. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You think she's gonna report you? I mean, that kind of thing doesn't just disappear." "I don't know," Brent admitted. "But it's not like I did anything wrong. I was just doing my job." Jake gave him a skeptical look. "Were you, though? Or were you doing your version of the job?" Brent glared at him, but Jake didn't back down. Instead, he stood and clapped Brent on the shoulder. "Look, man, I'm just saying be careful. If she's FBI, she's probably got bigger fish to fry. But if you gave her a reason to come after you, She's not gonna let it go. Brent watched as Jake walked away, the weight of his words sinking in. He hated to admit it, but Jake was right. Margaret Daniels wasn't the kind of person who would just forget what happened. And if she was looking for something, anything, to use against him, she'd find it. Meanwhile, Margaret had spent the afternoon making quiet inquiries around the neighborhood. She didn't ask about Brent directly. She knew better than to draw attention to herself. But she listened carefully to the way people talked about the police. It didn't take long to pick up on the unease. A shop owner mentioned an officer who always seemed to show up when things were too quiet. A young man muttered something about being stopped for no reason while walking home late at night. A mother of two talked about how she never let her kids play outside after dark, just in case. Margaret filed it all away in her mind, knowing it was only the tip of the iceberg. She also noticed something else. The way certain people clammed up when she asked too many questions, their eyes darting around nervously, as if they were afraid of being overheard. It was subtle, but it told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just about a few bad officers. There was a culture here. A system that had been allowed to thrive unchecked. That evening, Margaret sat in her living room, reviewing the files Collins had sent her again. One name kept coming up alongside Brent's, Lieutenant Paul Grayson. He wasn't just Brent's superior. He was one of the most powerful men in the department, someone who had been with the force for decades and knew how to navigate the system. Margaret had dealt with men like him before, and they were always the hardest to pin down. They didn't leave evidence behind. They didn't get their hands dirty. But they pulled the strings. As Margaret dug deeper, she found something that made her pause. One of the missing evidence cases involved a high-profile drug bust that had fallen apart in court because key pieces of evidence, namely the seized drugs, had mysteriously disappeared from the evidence room. The officer in charge of the bust, Brent Harper, and the man who had signed off on the evidence log, Paul Grayson. Margaret's mind raced as she pieced it together. This wasn't just about harassment or profiling. This was bigger. Missing evidence, corruption, possible ties to something deeper. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for sure. The rot in this department ran deep, and it wasn't going to be easy to expose. Across town, Brent sat in his car again, staring at the same empty lot he had parked in the night before. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, though the lot was deserted. His mind kept circling back to Margaret Daniels and the look on her face when she showed him her badge. It wasn't just confidence, it was something more. Determination. A promise. For the first time in his career, Brent felt truly vulnerable. It wasn't a feeling he liked, and it wasn't one he planned to let linger. But what he didn't realize was that the game he'd been playing all these years, the game of power, authority, and control, was no longer his to control. Margaret had seen too much, heard too much, and she wasn't about to back down. And somewhere in the shadows, the larger forces behind this web of corruption were starting to stir, their secrets threatened by her quiet, unyielding presence. The tension in the air was growing thicker by the hour. And though neither Brent nor Margaret knew it yet, their paths were on a collision course, one that would force them both to confront truths they weren't ready to face. The streets were quieter than usual that evening, almost unnervingly so. Margaret stood at her window, staring out into the darkened neighborhood. She could feel it in her gut. Something was shifting, and the pieces were beginning to come together, but not in a way that gave her any comfort. The files Collins had sent hinted at corruption, yes, but the deeper she dug, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about power-hungry cops or disappearing evidence. There was something bigger here, something calculated. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the heavy silence. Margaret picked it up and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice steady. Daniels. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, all she could hear was the faint sound of breathing. You're poking around where you shouldn't be, a low voice finally said. Male calm, but with an edge that made Margaret's skin prickle. Who is this? She asked, and tone sharp. Another pause. Then the voice spoke again, this time with a hint of warning. You think you know what's going on, but you don't. Walk away while you still can. The line went dead before she could respond. Margaret lowered the phone slowly, her mind racing. The call was both a threat and a confirmation. She was on the right track, and someone didn't want her to be. It wasn't the first time she'd been threatened in her line of work, but this felt different, more personal. She pulled up the files again, scanning through them with fresh eyes. The missing evidence, the complaints of excessive force, the sudden dead ends in certain cases, it all pointed to something larger. And at the center of it was Paul Grayson. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just covering for his officers. He was orchestrating something, and Brent Harper, whether he knew it or not, was a piece on Grayson's chessboard. Across town, Brent sat in his car outside the precinct, staring at the entrance. He had been called in for an unscheduled meeting with Grayson, and he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his chest. Grayson rarely called officers in after hours, unless it was serious, and Brent had a sinking suspicion that this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. Inside, Grayson was waiting in his office, his usual calm demeanor betraying none of the tension that hung in the air. Brent knocked on the door hesitantly, stepping inside when Grayson waved him in. Harper, Grayson said, leaning back in his chair. Take a seat. Brent did as he was told, his hands gripping his knees as he waited for Grayson to speak. You've been distracted lately, Grayson said, his tone measured. Anything I should know about? Brent hesitated, choosing his words carefully. No, sir, just been dealing with some things. Nothing that affects my work. Grayson studied him for a moment, his piercing gaze making Brent squirm. You're a good cop, Harper, but good cops need to stay focused. There are a lot of people out there looking for any excuse to tear us down. You understand that, don't you? Yes, sir, Brent said quickly, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Grayson leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. I hear you had a run-in with a woman the other day. FBI. Brent's stomach dropped. It wasn't anything serious, he said, trying to keep his tone even. She showed me her badge, and that was it. Grayson's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. Good, let's keep it that way. The last thing we need is someone like her sniffing around where she doesn't belong. Brent nodded, but the unease in his chest only grew. Grayson's words were meant to reassure him, but they had the opposite effect. It was clear now, Margaret Daniels wasn't just a passing problem. She was a threat, and Grayson was preparing to deal with her. As Brent left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. Grayson's calm exterior hid something darker, something Brent wasn't sure he wanted to see. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't have a choice. Grayson was watching him now, and any misstep could cost him everything. Margaret, meanwhile, was piecing together the connections between Grayson and the missing evidence cases. She had reached out to a former colleague at the Bureau, someone who had worked on corruption cases before, and they had confirmed her suspicions. The patterns she was seeing weren't random. They were the hallmarks of a larger operation, one that involved not just local cops, but potentially higher-ups in the justice system. But Margaret knew she couldn't take this to Collins yet. She needed more. Hard evidence. Something that couldn't be explained away or swept under the rug. And to get that, she needed to take a risk. The next day, she decided to pay a visit to the precinct. It was a calculated move, one that could easily backfire. But Margaret was done waiting for answers to come to her. She needed to see Grayson in person, to get a read on him. When she walked through the precinct doors, the room seemed to pause for a moment. Officers glanced up from their desks, their conversations trailing off as they registered who she was. Margaret held her head high, her expression calm and unreadable, but inside, her heart was pounding. The desk sergeant looked up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Lieutenant Grayson," Margaret said smoothly. "Tell him Agent Daniels is here." The sergeant hesitated for a moment before picking up the phone. Margaret could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Why was she here? What did she want? After a moment, the sergeant hung up and nodded toward the hallway. "He'll see you." Margaret walked down the hall, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. When she reached Grayson's office, he was standing behind his desk, his hands clasped behind his back. "Agent Daniels," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Margaret stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I thought it was time we had a conversation," she said, her tone steady. Grayson gestured to the chair in front of his desk, but Margaret didn't sit. She wanted to keep the upper hand, to control the room. "I've been looking into some things," she said, meeting his gaze, "things that don't add up." Grayson's expression didn't change, but Margaret could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, maybe even fear. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, his tone measured. Margaret smiled slightly. "I think you do." The air in the room seemed to thicken, the tension crackling like a live wire. Grayson leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "Be careful, Agent Daniels," he said quietly. "You might not like what you find." Margaret held his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not the one who needs to be careful," she said. As she left the precinct, Margaret knew she had pushed Grayson's buttons. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she was getting closer, and she could feel the walls closing in around him. But what she didn't know was how far Grayson was willing to go to protect his secrets, or how much danger she was walking into. As Margaret walked out of the precinct, the cold evening air hit her like a wave. She kept her face steady, her stride purposeful, but inside, she was wrestling with an uneasy feeling. Grayson's parting words weren't just a veiled threat. They were a challenge. He knew she was getting close, and she could feel the weight of his eyes on her as she left. But Margaret had been in high-stakes situations before. The trick wasn't in avoiding the pressure. It was in using it to your advantage. Her phone buzzed in her pocket as she reached her car. A message from Collins. It was a short text, but the words made her pause. "Asterisk, we need to talk. Now." Asterisk. Margaret quickly started the engine and headed toward the safe house where she and Collins had agreed to meet if things got messy. She couldn't ignore the timing. For Collins to pull her in now, something new must have surfaced, something big. When she arrived, Collins was already waiting, his laptop open on the table and papers scattered around him. His face was tense, the usual calm professionalism replaced with visible concern. Margaret barely had time to shut the door before he started talking. "Margaret, we've got a problem," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I've been running deeper checks into Grayson's connections, and something came up that I didn't expect." Margaret leaned forward, her instincts on high alert. "What kind of problem?" Collins turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a list of names, officers, lawyers, local business owners, even a judge or two. At first glance, it seemed like a random collection of people, but as Margaret scanned the names, a pattern began to emerge. "These are all people tied to cases where evidence went missing or charges were mysteriously dropped," Collins explained. "And they're all connected to Grayson in some way. But here's the kicker. He's not just covering for dirty cops. He's facilitating something bigger." Margaret's stomach tightened. Bigger how? Collins hesitated before answering. "Drug money. Laundering. This isn't just a precinct problem, Margaret. It's an operation. Grayson's running it, or at least protecting it. And he's got people in every corner helping him keep it under wraps." The revelation hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. She had suspected corruption, maybe even a small network of complicit officers, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just about abuse of power or missing evidence. It was a criminal enterprise hiding in plain sight. And there's more, Collins said. Is Tom brave? I checked the names against recent FBI case files, and I found something disturbing. A few months ago, an undercover agent working a similar case in another city disappeared. No warning, no trace. And guess who was in contact with the precinct she was working out of? He pointed to Grayson's name on the screen. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had read about that case. A promising young agent vanished without a trace during an investigation. The Bureau had suspected foul play, but without evidence, the case had gone cold. Now it seemed like it might be connected to Grayson's web. Collins leaned closer. Margaret, you need to be careful. If Grayson had something to do with that agent's disappearance, he won't hesitate to come after you. You've already made yourself a target. Margaret nodded, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't back down now, but she also couldn't afford to underestimate Grayson. He wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was dangerous, and he had the resources to protect himself. Later that night, Margaret sat in her car outside a quiet diner, waiting for her contact to arrive. She had reached out to an old friend from her days working organized crime cases, someone who had a knack for uncovering hidden financial trails. If there was money flowing through Grayson's operation, she needed to find it. Money left traces, and those traces could be the key to taking him down. As she waited, her mind drifted back to Brent Harper. He had been quiet since their last encounter, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in the middle of something he didn't fully understand. He wasn't innocent, far from it. But there was a difference between someone who played the game to get ahead and someone who orchestrated the game itself. Brent, for all his flaws, didn't strike her as a mastermind. He was a pawn, and pawns could be useful if you played them right. Across town, Brent was sitting alone in his apartment, nursing a beer and staring at the folder on his coffee table. It was the same folder Grayson had handed him earlier that day. Its contents as damning as they were dangerous. Inside were photos, bank statements and memos, proof of just how deep the corruption ran. Grayson had made it clear that Brent's name was now tied to everything in that folder. If anything came to light, Brent would go down with the rest of them. He hated himself for it, but he couldn't stop thinking about Margaret Daniels. She wasn't like anyone he'd encountered before. She didn't flinch, didn't back down, and worst of all, she made him see himself in a way he didn't like. For years, he had convinced himself that he was just doing what he had to do, that he wasn't part of the problem. But now, faced with the truth, he couldn't ignore the reality. He was part of the problem, whether he liked it or not. The sound of his phone buzzing broke his thoughts. He picked it up, his heart sinking when he saw Grayson's name on the screen. Taking a deep breath, he answered. Harper. Grayson's voice came through, calm but commanding. We've got a situation. Meet me at the lot in 20 minutes. Brent knew better than to argue. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, the folder still sitting on the coffee table like a ticking time bomb. Meanwhile, Margaret's contact finally arrived, sliding into the booth across from her with a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He was a wiry man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a knack for finding things no one else could. I got your message, he said, pulling out his laptop. What are we looking at? Margaret handed him the files Collins had shared, along with a list of names she had compiled. I need to know where the money's coming from and where it's going. Follow the paper trail. If there's a connection to Grayson, I need it. The man nodded, already typing away. This might take a while, but if there's dirt to find, I'll find it. As he worked, Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an anonymous tip. The message was short but chilling. Asterisk, you're not the only one watching Grayson. Be ready. Asterisk. Her pulse quickened. Who had sent the message? And what did they mean by be ready? Back at the lot, Brent pulled in to find Grayson waiting, his expression unreadable. As Brent stepped out of the car, He noticed something he hadn't seen before, a sense of urgency in Grayson's demeanor. "Harper," Grayson said, his voice low. "We've got a leak. Someone's been asking questions, digging where they shouldn't. We need to shut it down now." Brent's stomach turned as he realized who Grayson was talking about. Margaret. As Grayson continued to speak, laying out a plan that was as vague as it was ominous, Brent's mind raced. He was in too deep now, tied to Grayson's operation whether he liked it or not. But as Grayson's words sank in, one thing became clear. If he didn't act soon, Margaret might not get the chance to finish what she had started. Brent stood in the shadows of the abandoned lot, the cold night air cutting through his jacket. Grayson's words still echoed in his head. Asterisk, we need to shut it down. Asterisk, he hadn't said Margaret's name directly, but Brent knew exactly who Grayson was targeting. His hands trembled as he clenched his fists. This wasn't what he signed up for. Grayson had framed it all as loyalty, as looking out for the department, but Brent was finally seeing it for what it really was. A desperate man willing to destroy anyone to protect himself. Across town, Margaret sat in her car, parked near a quiet strip of warehouses. Her contact had come through faster than she expected, uncovering bank transfers and property holdings that tied Grayson directly to shell companies laundering money from illegal operations. The evidence was overwhelming. Grayson wasn't just complicit. He was running the entire operation, but Margaret's victory felt hollow. She could feel the danger closing in. The anonymous text had been a warning, but from whom? And what exactly was she supposed to be ready for? Margaret decided she couldn't wait any longer. She picked up her phone and dialed Collins. "I've got enough to bring Grayson down," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "But I need backup. I'm heading to his warehouse on Jefferson. Meet me there." Collins hesitated on the other end. "Margaret, are you sure? If you're wrong about this, it could blow up in your face." "I'm not wrong," she replied firmly. "Just get there." As she hung up, headlights flashed in her rear-view mirror. Her heart skipped a beat as a black SUV pulled up behind her, its engine idling. For a moment, she thought it was Grayson or one of his men. But then the driver's side door opened, and Brent Harper stepped out. He walked cautiously toward her car, his hands visible, signaling he wasn't there to harm her. Margaret rolled down the window slightly, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. "What do you want, Harper?" He stopped a few feet away, his face tense but determined. "You were right about Grayson," he said quietly. "He's planning something tonight, and it involves you. I don't know all the details, but he's not just going to let you walk away." Margaret studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. There was fear in his eyes, but also something else, guilt. He looked like a man on the edge, torn between his loyalty to Grayson and his conscience. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I've had enough," he admitted. "I've been looking the other way for too long, and I can't keep pretending I'm not part of this. Grayson's gone too far, and if I don't do something now, it's only going to get worse." Margaret weighed her options. Trusting Brent was a risk, but he had access to Grayson that she didn't. If he was telling the truth, he could be a valuable ally. "Get in," she said, unlocking the passenger door. "But if this is some kind of trap, you won't get a second chance." Brent nodded and climbed into the car. As they drove toward the warehouse, he filled her in on what he knew. Grayson had ordered him to meet with a couple of enforcers, men who weren't cops, but who did Grayson's dirty work off the books. Their job was to handle Margaret. Brent didn't know the specifics, but he could tell by Grayson's tone that this wasn't just about intimidation. They were planning to silence her for good. When they arrived at the warehouse, Margaret parked a safe distance away. The building was dark, but there was a faint glow coming from a window on the second floor. She could make out the silhouettes of men moving inside. "Stay here," she told Brent, reaching for her weapon. "You're not going in alone, are you?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "I don't have a choice," she said. "If Grayson sees you with me, He'll know you've turned. Just stay out of sight and be ready to move if things go south. Margaret slipped out of the car and approached the warehouse, her footsteps silent against the gravel. She found a side door that was slightly ajar and slipped inside, her senses on high alert. The air smelled of oil and damp concrete, and the faint hum of machinery echoed through the cavernous space. She moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows as she made her way toward the stairs. As she climbed, she could hear voices coming from the room above. Grayson's unmistakable tone cut through the air, calm and commanding. "She's a problem that needs to be solved. Tonight. No loose ends." Margaret's heart pounded as she reached the top of the stairs. Peering through the crack in the door, she saw Grayson standing with two men, both armed. A table in the center of the room was covered in documents, a laptop, and a duffel bag she guessed was full of cash. Before she could make her move, her phone buzzed in her pocket, the sound loud in the quiet. She cursed under her breath as Grayson's head snapped toward the door. "Check it out," he ordered one of the men. Margaret had no choice. She burst through the door, her weapon drawn. "FBI, drop your weapons." The room erupted into chaos. One of the enforcers raised his gun, but Margaret fired first, hitting him in the shoulder. The other man dove for cover, and Grayson grabbed the laptop, shoving it into the duffel bag as he bolted for the back exit. Margaret ducked behind the table as bullets ricocheted off the walls. She could hear Grayson's footsteps retreating and knew she couldn't let him get away. She took a deep breath, then popped up and fired, hitting the second man in the leg. He went down with a yell, clutching his knee. Margaret sprinted after Grayson, her adrenaline surging. She chased him down a narrow hallway that led to a loading dock. As she burst through the doors, she found him climbing into a waiting car. Without thinking, she fired at the tires, the loud pop of rubber bursting echoing in the night. The car lurched to a stop, and Grayson stumbled out, his hands raised. "It's over, Grayson," Margaret said, her gun trained on him. But before she could cuff him, Brent appeared behind her, holding the duffel bag. "Margaret," he said, his voice shaky. "You need to see this." She glanced at him wary. "What is it?" Brent opened the bag, revealing not just the laptop and cash, but something that made Margaret's blood run cold. Photos and files detailing the undercover agent who had gone missing. And among them was a hit list, her name at the very top. Grayson smirked, his composure returning. "You think you've won, Daniels. You're just a piece of the puzzle. You have no idea how deep this goes." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Collins had arrived with backup, and within moments, Grayson was in cuffs. But his words lingered in Margaret's mind. The evidence they had was enough to bring Grayson down, but the hit list hinted at something much bigger. "No," Brent agreed, his voice heavy with realization. "It's just beginning." The night had settled into a heavy silence as Margaret watched the flashing red and blue lights cast airy shadows on the warehouse walls. Grayson was finally in custody, hauled into the back of a squad car with his smug grin wiped clean. But Margaret couldn't shake the knot in her chest. This victory felt hollow, more like uncovering the edge of a bigger monster rather than slaying it. Collins approached her, his face grim but steady. "The forensics team will comb through everything. We've got enough evidence here to nail Grayson for corruption, racketeering, and conspiracy." He paused, glancing at the duffel bag in Brent's hands. "And that hit list? That's going to open an entirely new investigation." Margaret nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on the car carrying Grayson away. His parting words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, "You have no idea how deep this goes." Asterisk, she believed him. Grayson wasn't the mastermind. He was just a cog in a machine much larger than she had imagined. Brent stood awkwardly to the side, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He wasn't used to this side of things, being surrounded by cops. knowing he was no longer just a passive player in Grayson's world. He glanced at Margaret and cleared his throat. "What happens to me now?" he asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Margaret turned to him, studying his face. "That depends on you," she said. "You helped me tonight. That counts for something. But you've been complicit for a long time, Brent. You can't just walk away from that." Brent lowered his gaze, shame flickering across his face. "I didn't know it would go this far," he muttered. "I thought I could stay out of the worst of it." "You had a choice," Margaret said, her tone firm but not unkind. "And now you have another one. Cooperate fully, tell us everything you know, and maybe, maybe, you can start making things right." He hesitated, then nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, and for the first time, there was a hint of sincerity in his voice. "I just want to fix what I can." Margaret turned to Collins. "Make sure he's processed as a cooperating witness," she said. "But keep him under watch. If he tries to play us, it's over." Collins nodded and signaled for an officer to take Brent in for questioning. As Brent was led away, Margaret felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Pity, maybe, or a faint glimmer of hope that he could redeem himself. But she didn't dwell on it. There was too much work to do. The hours blurred together as the team collected evidence from the warehouse. Margaret sifted through the files and documents, her focus razor-sharp despite the exhaustion creeping in. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of Grayson's operation. Money laundering through local businesses, connections to higher-ups who had kept him protected, and the systematic silencing of anyone who got too close to the truth. It was overwhelming, but it was also exactly what she needed to bring the entire network crushing down. By the time the sun began to rise, Margaret was back at FBI headquarters, briefing her superiors. The evidence was enough to launch a massive investigation, one that would take down not just Grayson, but everyone he was tied to. It was the kind of case that could define a career or destroy one. As the meeting wrapped up, her supervisor, Agent Monroe, pulled her aside. "You did good work, Daniels," he said. "But you know this is just the beginning. If Grayson's operation goes as deep as we think it does, you're going to be stepping on some very powerful toes." Margaret met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "I'm ready," she said simply. Monroe nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Get some rest," he said. "You're going to need it." But rest didn't come easily for Margaret. That evening, as she sat in her apartment, the weight of everything finally hit her. She had exposed a network of corruption that had festered for years, but at what cost? Grayson's hit list was a stark reminder that she wasn't untouchable. She thought of the undercover agent who had disappeared, her life cut short by the same web of deceit Margaret was now unraveling. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. But when she looked through the peephole, she saw Collins standing there with a takeout bag in one hand and a tired smile on his face. "You look like you could use dinner," he said as she opened the door. Margaret stepped aside to let him in. "Thanks," she said, her voice softer than usual, "but I'm not sure I'll be able to eat." Collins set the bag on the counter and gave her a knowing look. "You will," he said. "You've been running on fumes for days. You can't take down a corrupt empire on an empty stomach."